Oh. I'm gonna do a more creative intro, but my cat's sitting in my chair, so I don't want to move it. Hi, Zizaran here, and I wanted to make a quick video talking about elemental equilibrium, elemental overload, how they work, when we use them, and just like a quick explanation, and maybe I'll even throw in spiritual aid just because why not. So the two keystones that I want to talk about, we have elemental equilibrium, we have elemental overload, and I'll do like a quick talk about spiritual aid as well, because these can be very, very complicated and lead to a lot of questions from players. I generally do try to explain them in build guides, but they have a lot of like generic purposes that, you know, it's just useful to make a video explaining them. So on the build I'm playing right now, we're using elemental equilibrium, which says enemies you hit with elemental damage temporarily gets 25 resist to those elements and minus 50 resist to other elements. And for this, we actually do need to hit, we do need to do damage, because if I hit something with 0 cold damage, it actually doesn't count. If you were, for example, using Ancestral Bond, you can't deal damage with skills yourself, you'd have a hard time doing any damage. Elemental Equilibrium is used a lot with degen skills. So for example, Righteous Fire, Scorching Ray, Ignite builds, and stuff like that. You can use it with LE Hit. I've used it with things like Flame Wall. There's some really, really cool use cases for it. And it's particularly the most popular with Righteous Fire and Summoners. They're like the most popular. And the reason for that is because you have to hit yourself to trigger it. And that means that we're basically getting free damage on a lot of Summoners and on Righteous Fire. So first let's explain how it works with, for example, Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire is just a fire degen around you, right? The circle, it never hits anything. So even though you are actively dealing fire damage to enemies, you're never triggering Elemental Equilibrium because there is no hit component. And that means that you can then have, for example, Orb of Storms on Storm Run. That's just preference. Storm Run is probably the better one. But I don't know. I feel very comfortable with Orb of Storms sometimes. But then you would put down Orb of Storms, and the number one thing to be careful of is that it doesn't say fire damage. So for the build, for both Righteous Fire and the build I'm playing right now, this could say lightning damage and it could say cold damage. But if it said fire damage, I would actually be buffing the enemies with 25 resist. But since mine only says lightning, that means that they get minus fire and minus cold. But if I had all three, you aren't getting anything negative. You aren't getting minus 25. You are in fact getting plus 25 to everything. So you are just gimping your damage. So some common fuck ups for this is on Righteous Fire builds, sometimes people will have like a weapon that either has fire damage to attacks. That means that every time you're shield charging something, you're giving them fire resist. Or even worse, they might have a ring or a weapon with fire damage to spells. So if your Orb of Storms ever says fire damage in a Righteous Fire build or Storm Run, that's really, really bad. So that's a common thing to, that's very, very easy to fuck up. And it's so good. Like I'm using it now for Summon Raging Spirits, and I have so much damage that I only need to use it on bosses. And I do have Orb of Storms, Hex Touch, and Flammability as well. So not only am I getting the minus 50 res from EE, but they're also getting another minus 44 res from Flammability. So it's incredibly strong, and it gives me a lot more damage. Now, some people are like, well, Zizaran, aren't you EEing with your Flame Dash if you flame dash through a boss? Yes, that is correct. But let's say that this table is the boss, right? And I might even have Combustion. So now what will happen is I will Flame Dash through the boss, it'll get combusted for minus 19 fire res, and then I will have Orb of Storms down. Now, think of it as like every tick refreshes it. So if I like Flame Dash it, like boom, 50 fire damage, but it instantly takes lightning damage afterwards, it is now again weak to fire. It doesn't like permanently remember that like, oh, it hit me with Flame Dash this one time in 2 years ago, so now I'm strong versus fire. And that means that it's actually a pretty cool thing for like Trinity builds, and you can have like alternating elemental equilibrium on a LE hit build. Say you're only doing fire and lightning, right? Then you're like, boom, fire, and then weak to lightning, boom, etc. And elemental hit actually has some really cool interactions with EE because they have the jewels that LE hit doesn't choose fire, but they actually do more than that. If you have Ellie hit doesn't choose fire, even if that Ellie hit is going through a flame wall, it never deals fire for any reason. So even if you have loads of things giving fire, like you could have avatar fire, you could have a global damage ring, you could have it go through flame wall, there is nothing that can make Ellie hit do fire damage with that jewel in. And that's very, very strong, because that means that you can have a build like Flame Wall where you are literally just scaling the Flame Wall dot and slaying that, and you can directly EE on every hit. So I've quite enjoyed that, and that's very strong. So again, just the number one thing to make sure is that whatever you are like actively EEing with, you want to make sure that it's ideally just one element. Well, in my case, I could have Lightning and Cold, but it's very, very important. That's the easiest thing to screw up. And then next up, let's talk about Elemental Overload. Elemental Overload is incredibly strong, especially for the leveling portion of the game. There are some builds that use this end game, but it is incredibly good early game, because early game, you're maybe not like able to get that like a large amount of crit. You might not have like really, really good gear, no items with base crit. So Elemental Overload, just incredibly good, because for both the Templar and the Witch, and even Shadow can get to it fairly quickly, but Templar and Witch can get to it like first 15, 20 levels. And the way this works is that you get 40% more elemental damage if you've dealt a crit in the past 8 seconds. So for this, you want to make sure you have somewhere between at least 3 to 7% crit, because you do still want to deal critical strikes. And that means that you can't really easily use Control Destruction early on. Control Destruction doesn't stop you from critting, but let's say that you have a spell that has a 5 or a 6 base crit and you put in Control Destruction early on, you're probably going to have 0 crit. Later on, when maybe you have like 100 or 200% crit on your gear, and you might end up having 5 or 10% controlled or crit with controlled in, then it's fine. But you do want to make sure that the buff would be like up here, and it literally looks the same way the Keystone does. And you don't actually need to deal damage for this. You can actually do this with Ancestral Bond, because this just needs to crit. That means that you could use it on totem builds, because totems can't proc this yourself, but you could have an Orb of Storms or a Stormbrand, maybe with increased critical strikes, that you are throwing down and giving yourself a damage boost. Obviously, it's like even better to just do critical on totems, because keeping the buff up can be a pain. But it is very, very strong. Another really common mistake with Elemental Overload is maybe you're leveling with Elemental Overload, but your build endgame is crit. And I've had several people being like, hey, I'm following your build. I have like 300 crit or something, and I'm not dealing any damage. And I'm like, they still have EO? And they're like, if you are going crit, remember to unspec out of this, because basically it caps your crit multi at 100, so you just don't deal any more damage. You just get the 40% more, which is great. It's basically like a support gem. But crit is obviously a lot more endgame once you're able to get 3, 4, 5, 6, 700 crit multi, right? So much damage. For example, Blade Blast Chieftain, you actually just like spec Elemental Overload endgame. You're not really able to go crit. And something that's really good with Elemental Overload is that it scales, for example, a converted Chest Explosion or Impulsa. And that's actually one of the easier ways to scale that, because it has no base crit. So you're forced to be Assassin and maybe get a Hatred Watcher Sign. With the crit base. It's very, very hard to make the Chest Explosion crit. Headhunter as well is actually pretty good for making the Chest Explosion crit. And last, that's just a quick explanation. Spiritual Aid is used in a lot of build guides, particularly Ascendants or Necromancers. But how does it work? What does it do? Well, as it says on the note, increases and reductions to minion damage also affect you. The simple way to think about this is having Spiritual Aid makes, for example, this be the same as 12% increased damage. And that's really, really good for Necromancers, because obviously you're getting like 60 or 40% minion damage for free, even more sometimes depending on what nodes you take. Now, it does not make attack and cast speed, movement speed, anything like that, and it does not make the minion damage support gem work for you, because that is more minion damage. There is another one here, which is minion attack speed also affect you, but there is no way to make minion cast speed affect you. So with Spiritual Command and Spiritual Aid, we do have the options of getting both minion attack speed and minion damage affect you. There's another really, really good thing about Spiritual Aid. It can be sometimes hard to get a jewel with 4 damage mods, but do remember, when you have Spiritual Aid, minions still increase damage is the same as just increased damage. So you do get one more stat on jewels as well. And yeah, it's just a very, very good pickup if you're in this area and you're already in Ascendancy that gets a lot of minion damage. It's also sometimes very, very useful whenever people are playing Herald builds or you're trying to scale the chest explosion like in Pulsa, because this is generic global damage that scales everything. Anyway, I just wanted to make this quick video talking about those three things because I know there's a lot of confusion about them and people aren't really sure on how they work. But I hope this helps, hope it makes sense and explains Path of Exile a little bit better to you. Again, as always, sub if you like the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do.